So let me introduce the two remaining members of this roundtable panel. So we have Professor Nigel Gilbert. He's a distinguished chair to computational social sciences and a director of the Center for Research in Social Simulations. He is at the University of Surrey. And then we have Professor Mike Spagat. He is Department of Economics at Royal Holloway, and he actually, together with political scientists, ran a masterclass last year in machine learning and conflict prediction. Thank you very much for being here. Nigel, the floor is yours, and then we'll move to Mike, and hopefully we can have a dialogue.
Well, I'll make some brief remarks. You can all hear me, can you? Good. So I'll try and be controversial, because otherwise it's a bit boring. I thought that Christine Hines' talk we've just heard was really nice. It's really good points. And I thought one of the nicest things was the very last line of her very last slide, where she said that social science can act as a collaborator, critic, and social conscience of AI. And what I want to suggest in my remarks is that, yes, indeed, but when we say collaborator, we must be very careful that we're not the sort of junior partner. I want to suggest that social science has much more to say than that, and that technology should be much more, well, perhaps, to be generous, let's say that technology should be an equal partner, but also perhaps being less generous should be the junior partner in that collaboration. And I want to go on to suggest some of the ways in which I've been involved, in which technology has, in a sense, been a junior partner. Before I do that, I just want to make a quick point about terminology, because this session is actually labelled AI. I'm a bit hesitant about that. I think we ought not to call it AI. AI to me is something very specific, and a lot of what Christine, for example, was talking about, I wouldn't categorize as AI at all. Digital, yes. But the Internet of Things, for example, that she mentioned, and all these sensors and so on, that has almost nothing to do with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is about intelligence, and there's not much intelligence in a sensor. There may be some intelligence about in the way in which the data from sensors is analysed, although even that, it seems to me, much of the time, the analysis is not very intelligent. But that's a kind of side point. I'm going to be talking about digital rather than AI. So, one way in which we can use digital in social science is actually to do social science with digital technology. And I've been, for the last, rather embarrassingly long time, been using a technique, an approach called agent-based modeling to do social science. Now, agent-based modeling is actually a rather lovely idea. It's the idea that we can create artificial societies of agents and then study the way in which those societies emerge in the computer. Now, this may sound a bit science fiction-y, but how many of you have played, well, let's say first-person shooter computer games? You're all using agent-based modeling. The only difference is that the rules that the agents or avatars are following in those games are ones that are set up by the game designer to make the game fun. What I do, or we do, is to do the same sort of thing, only in our rules, or the rules that the avatar follows, are ones that we set up to resemble what we think people and societies do. So we can, in that sense, create artificial societies. They're obviously very simplified, but then, social theories are always simplifications of reality. The great advantage of doing this kind of thing is that it forces you to be precise, coherent, consistent, and so on. You can't get away with kind of woolly theoretical statements if what you actually need to do is to tell an agent in the computer what to do. You've got to be very precise. And I think you can probably see that. So we've built agent-based models of all sorts of different kinds of social phenomena. Perhaps the most approachable one, in some sense, is that we modeled the mafia and how the mafia works. That was quite fun. Fortunately, the mafia didn't actually come and find out about us, so we were okay. But we've also done more other work in environmental management, in irrigation in Africa, and the management of water for irrigation in Africa. Well, a long list. I won't bother you with them all. So that's one way in which we're using technology to do social science. Another completely different way of doing things is of using technology. It relates to a project which I'm currently involved in, and that is examining the use of artificial intelligence, and this really is artificial intelligence now, for what we call social assessment. Well, social assessment is a jargon name for the kinds of things that go on, let's say, in a job centre, where somebody, you go in without a job and you talk to somebody and they go through your circumstances and they try and, possibly anyway, offer you or find you a job vacancy. Or employers who are trying to fill a vacancy and working their way through a pile of 1,000 CVs that people have applied for the job. Or you are applying for some kind of welfare benefit of some kind of social security, for example. Those are all ready examples of what we call social assessment. Now, increasingly, that kind of job is being automated using AI systems. Not so much in the UK so far, because we're actually rather behind. But in America, in Scandinavia, in Estonia, Latvia, and other countries, AI or AI-like algorithms are being routinely used for such things, also in China. What our project is concerned with is whether we can, well, these kinds of algorithms are potentially suffer from all the kinds of difficulties and biases that the two keynote speakers this morning talked about. And you won't be particularly surprised by that, I don't think. What we're trying to do is to see whether, with social science hats on, as it were, we can think of ways of devising better algorithms that suffer less from the kinds of injustices, biases, lack of transparency, and so on, that we assume, probably rightly assume, the existing algorithms suffer from. And so how do we do that? Well, what we have done so far is to construct what we call computer games. They're essentially, we're getting groups of people, citizens, stakeholders and others, to play at being claimants, or people who are being assessed, and agents, i.e. people who are assessing, with a set of standard standardized features of the people being assessed. So we get them to play, in a serious game sort of way, how they think this current, well, first of all, we use the current system, the current algorithms, and then we get them to think about what will be a better algorithm to use. And that data, because we record all these games, and we do it through a computer so that we have an exact record of exactly what everybody is deciding, talking about. And we use that data in order to generate better algorithms using essentially a machine learning technique. So that's again a way in which we have been using the technology to generate better algorithms that are informed by a critique, like a social science critique of how these algorithms work, and using our, as it were, social science common sense to run what you might think of as a kind of computerized focus group to help us with that. So those are two actual examples of how social science can use technology rather than technology, rather than social science being a sort of handmaiden to technology, to making it easier to sell the technology, to make it look better, or ethically greenwash technology, which sometimes is the way that social science is brought in to technological development. Okay, I have other things that I could say, but I think I've said enough for the moment, and I'd be happy to discuss that or other things.
Can I ask you a question about the mafia thing?
Oh wow, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it.
I'm just really curious because obviously you were like, oh, we didn't meet any, interview mafia people. So where did that data come from? If you've never met them, how can you model something on a population you haven't engaged with?
Well, it turns out that actually there's an enormous amount of data about the mafia and how it works from journalistic and legal sources. So we didn't actually need to go and talk to individual members of the mafia. We got the police to do that and journalists to do that for us by proxy.
But what were you interested in explaining? And I mean, what happens in those models?
What we were interested in explaining was the way in which they were able to both survive and grow through extortion. The way in which the victims, who were often sort of small businesses and shopkeepers and so on, what the motivations were, such that they agreed, first of all, to be subjected to the mafia, and then nowadays the mafia, certainly in Sicily, the power of the mafia is much reduced, and how that worked. How they managed, principally shopkeepers, managed to overcome the power of the mafia? Those are the kinds of questions we were interested in.
I was just going to ask, from your findings then, you mentioned, what the motivation was. What did you find? Because there are obviously some settings or cultures where there are deep-seated corruption, etc., where certain people have more power. So it might be something quite meaningful that if we're able to know what motivates them, how such structures can somehow.
I think, to be honest, I'm going to skip that answering that and just refer you to the book. Because I can't, it was a number of years ago, I can't answer in sufficient detail, I think. And anyway, the book is quite interesting. It's called, I have to, I can't even remember the title of the book. It's by Corinna Elson-Broich and Nigel Gilbert, and you'll find it's called something about, the title's got something about social norms in it.
But could I ask, although you've already said this is kind of halfway out your head, but how do you set something like that up in the first place? Like, so you've got like these, you have to define different types of agents.
Yeah.
And then you have to give them motivations.
Yeah.
So you set up, like you had shopkeeper agents. What kind of?
Yes, exactly. You've got it right. And these agents have a set of norms, you might call it, or a set of rules, if you like, about how they act in different contexts. So, if they find that, for example, that there are many other agents who are acting in a similar way to them, they're more likely to do something. They bow to peer pressure, if you like. Think about it like that. Devising what those rules are is where the social science comes in. That's where the art is.
You looked at accounts of the mafia, and that gives you some idea how to set up the motivations.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And can I ask, for someone out there that's like not like a huge computer programmer, is there off-the-shelf software?
Yes.
How much? What is the entry cost to do something like this?
Can I also add to this? What kind of education training you need to receive to be able to do this?
Well, it's a great deal easier than it sounds. I think it's easier to at least start off in agent-based modelling than it is to master the complexities of SPSS and R and things of that kind. There is what we run courses. We usually get people to the point where they're working independently after 4 days, and we use a free open source package called NetLogo. NetLogo is a fascinating piece of software in itself because it was originally devised for use by secondary school students mainly in the States. It comes out of the University of Illinois. And NetLogo comes with a whole set of sample models which will teach you things like the physics of gases, simple ecology models, and a whole lot of things that, kind of school science. But it happens that you can also build quite interesting and sophisticated social science agent-based models as well. And so it's if school students can use it, I think you can too.
So that suggests really a pedagogical use for it, so that you can understand how things work. Like,
Do you want me to talk about what we were talking about before?
well, yeah, we could segue into that. I mean, you know, so yeah, we were talking just before this session started. You know, I asked, like, who are you? What are you doing here?
I got a very strange answer.
And it quickly came out that he's a sociologist who had written a textbook on economics, which is my field. You know, so you know, I might ask, like, what the hell were you doing? You know,
But he was polite enough not to say.
So he's written, and this is the first I've heard of it. But you know, so he's written a textbook in economics, and we were just starting to get into this a little bit. And one of the things I was gathering is, you know, for starters, by using agent-based modeling, it might make it easier for people to understand things which have been, you know, for forever, you know, just presented as an abstract mathematical model that instead, like, you can see maybe on a computer screen, you know, that's, you know, things actually happening in real time.
Let me give you a...
Okay, go ahead.
Well, let me ask first of all, how many of you have ever done any economics at all, even at the most simple level? Just put your hands up. Yeah, about half, I would say. Okay. Well, those of you who have, and even those of you who haven't, probably know that, you know, one of the fundamental issues about you know, topics in economics is, you know, what happens in markets. Well, the way that you know, introductory economics is usually taught is in terms of what are called supply and demand curves. So you have a plot, a graph of the price of an apple, or whatever it might be, a widget, given the amount of people who want to buy a widget, and given the amount of widgets that are available on the market to buy. And a classic result of economics that goes back, you know, several centuries is that the market price of the widget or the apple or whatever is the price at which the amount of the demand for the widgets equates to the supply, because, you know, if the price goes up, people will want to buy less, and if the price goes down, people if the price goes up, then people will want to buy less, but the more people will be making widgets, so the supply goes up as the price goes up. Anyway, so yeah, that's all very well, and it doesn't require a lot of thought to follow that. But actually, what's going on is a whole set of people who are wanting to buy widgets or wanting to sell widgets. And what you can do in agent-based modeling is to represent those people as agents in the computer who are trying to buy and sell. And if you do that, then you don't have to, well, I mean, you can generate these supply and demand curves from looking at the model as it runs. And this has, you know, certainly from a teaching point of view, this has several advantages. You can, for example, you know, look at the actions of any particular agent and see what is that way doing. You can measure the overall activity in your artificial market and see what happens. You can also, quite simply, and this is where I was coming to what you were saying just before we started, you can also do things like say, well, instead of anybody trading with anybody, as you might, for example, in an electronic stock exchange, let's be a little bit more physical about it and say, well, if somebody's going to buy an apple from somebody else, they have to be in the same place to do that. You know, like the Gilbert or wherever vegetable market, you actually have to go to the vegetable market in order to buy your vegetables. And that means that you get, as it were, mini markets geographically distributed. So he can only trade with him, and he can only trade with him, and therefore you get the possibility of having different prices there and there. Now that actually in simple, I mean obviously economists can manage that, but in simple economics that's quite difficult to handle. But if you have an agent-based model, it's kind of trivial. You just put one agent over here and one agent over here and see what happens when you don't allow them to trade beyond a certain radius in your artificial world. So there are some advantages in thinking. There's conceptual advantages because I think anyway it's easier to think about actual people rather than mathematical equations, and it's also easy to do some kind of extensions to the basics using agent-based modeling.
Okay.
And what we do in this book, just to finish off, is we take the standard syllabus of a first-year undergraduate economics course, which has a very well-known set of topics, markets, labour economics, finance, banking, and so on, and we address each of these topics using agent-based modelling as the basis, rather than just as equations.
And I would think that the payoff from doing this would not only be pedagogical, right? That so sometimes, or did you find that some things as they're normally taught are hard to replicate? It's hard to show that that would be the outcome of a process of actual people interacting.
Sometimes we had to. We found that we had to make explicit assumptions which are often implicit in the sort of standard texts. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone want to? I mean, I don't know if you've worked out, but I'm trying to cover up for my lack of knowledge by just asking Nigel questions. But but I guess the clock is running out. But does anyone want to ask him more questions? And I'll flap at you for a while. So as mentioned, I'm an economist, although somewhat strangely, I actually work on war, which is not unknown, but unusual for economists. And I've had occasion to be involved in some projects that have involved artificial intelligence, although I was never the kind of the driver in that aspect of it. But still, in the spirit of interdisciplinary work, working with people who are doing this kind of thing. So let me just describe one of these projects, and then hopefully it'll stimulate some interest. So there's been kind of a revolution in data about armed conflict. In fact, that was how I entered into the conflict field, because I made the error of doing my PhD dissertation on the Soviet economy, which then disappeared shortly after I'd finished my dissertation. And then I was working on the transition from communism for a while, but that I figured I was still, at that point I was still young, so I figured I couldn't do that forever. And then I had a Colombian PhD student who suggested that he could write his dissertation on the Colombian conflict, and then eventually he managed to get some money and a lot of relatively low-priced research assistants working in Colombia who put together this database with it. By the time he finished his dissertation, it had like 20,000 violent events in the Colombian conflict. Where an event will be something like a battle or a bombing or an air attack, something like that. But just a huge amount of labor in reading these reports. And then later I got involved with another organization called Iraq Body Count. Some of you may have heard of it, but they were doing the same kind of thing, but for the Iraq conflict. They were ready to go when that started in 2003, and there's actually still cataloging violent events in the Iraq conflict by hand, just reading media reports. Anyway, some computer scientists I knew at Royal Holloway got interested in this work, and we kind of came up with this project. So Iraq Body Count. In the course of doing all of their work, they've created an immense database, which is just the raw news stories that they have read and actually discussed in an online forum and then coded as conflict events. Where it'll say what kind of thing happened, how many people were killed, how many people were injured, at least as reported in the media. And then it's complicated because you'll have different media sources, won't necessarily report the same information. Actually, I should talk about these are the challenges that you face, that you can get multiple media reports and you're not sure if it's a single event or if it's actually multiple events. Maybe it could be in the same city on the same day, but more than one thing might have happened in that city on the same day. They might be reporting different numbers of people killed. Is that just a discrepancy in the reporting, or does that suggest that they're actually different occurrences? You'll get sometimes follow-up reports where injured people might have been taken to the hospital and died later, and some intrepid reporter has kind of tracked that all down and now updated the number of people killed. Also, it may be unclear whether the date that the article appeared in the media is actually the same as the date in which the event occurred, and they may be unclear in how that was presented. So there are a lot of ambiguities here, and the humans who are coding this stuff, they actually have an online forum where somebody posts a media report and then they discuss it, and then someone says, I think that's the same as from this report, and then maybe someone says, well, I disagree, and and then it eventually results in something or multiple things being coded. Well, now the question is, can a computer do that? While this was, I think, an unusually good opportunity to see what the computer can do here, because what you have is what I realized is referred to by the computer scientists here as quote, ground truth, in that that somehow you can make a fairly convincing claim that what the right answer is. So Iraq Body Count has archived a massive number of news stories, but they've also processed them into a database. And so you what the right answer is. Now, of course, humans make mistakes. So if you press the reset button and you went back and you had humans process, with the same care and attention, the same reports, they wouldn't get exactly the same answers again. But knowing what I know about how they go about doing this, I think would be pretty close. So we can say that this is the truth. Okay, so now you can set the computer loose on it using what's known as natural language processing, which is basically like the computer reading the information, and so the computer reads all of these reports, and you start here. So I'm describing, standard machine learning here, actually. So you start here, with actually I forget the term. You must know the term, but it's the learning base. You basically just take part of the data, part of the archive. And then you tell the computer, the computer knows what the results of the human coding is, and then it sees, can it come up with rules? So it's like learning to see whether it can come up with rules that will create something that looks so the computer ends up doing roughly what the humans did. But it's important that that's done on only part of the database, okay? And then the next step is you take the part that was not used, to come up with that system, for processing news reports into coded conflict events, and now you see what happens. How well does it perform on brand new data? Okay, and it's going to perform worse. Guaranteed, it's going to perform worse on the brand new data than it's going to perform, on the original data. Because it's going to when it learns, so to speak, on the original data, it's going to come up with I don't know what to call it, hacks, or it's going to come up with little rules that work just on that bit of data quite well, but that doesn't necessarily generalize to a slightly different setting, and this problem is called overfitting. That it tends to tune itself too well to the data that it looks at first, and I think maybe a graphic and simple example here, which I think is pretty well known, is that I think at one point a team of computer scientists had announced stunning results that they had taught a machine to tell the difference between wolves and dogs, just looking at pictures of them, and they were getting really accurate results. But upon closer examination, what they discovered is that all the pictures of wolves had snow in them, because they were filmed in Canada or so, taken in and the ones with the dogs didn't, So that's basically, but that worked. So whatever the machine learned, it worked perfectly or near perfectly on that data set. It's just that data set had that peculiar feature, which of course, if they had known, they never would have, trained it on that. But it had that specific feature that, wolves always appear with snow, and dogs don't. But then if you then try it on, some other data, but where you've got there set against snow and wolves not set against, then it goes haywire. So okay, there was a mistake, but I think that's the overfitting idea, that you get too closely tuned to the specifics of the first data that you look at, and then it doesn't generalize beyond there. But I think the bottom line from that particular project was that you could teach the computer to do this pretty well, but at least at the time, and this is, I think, a 10-year-old project now, so it could probably be done much better. Not well enough that, for example, an organization like Iraq Body Count would rather use that than what they do, because it was somehow, I think, impressive, and it was considered like a good publication in the natural language processing universe, but not really a technology you'd want to use if you really place a premium on making a very small number of errors. But for certain purposes, it would work great. If your idea, which was the idea of a rack body count, they want to make a memorial to all of the people killed in the conflict that will give due respect to each possible victim, then you really don't want to have that 10% of it is just errors. It may be that if your goal was, for example, to let's say to understand which weapons are causing the most harm to civilians, for example, it may be that you could get a decent answer to that question, and you could tolerate a 10% error rate in the data that you're collecting, which needs to be pointed out, is much less costly to put together than having a team of humans working for 20 years doing this work. So I think you've got to think about what you're trying to do here. Just as a coda to this particular story here, some planned research that I'm hoping to get going. We'll try to set standards for what this kind of conflict data should look like, and which we hope can then lead to practices in the writing of the stories, which are the raw materials here, that can actually make it easier to then produce machine coded data out of it. So that's maybe a story here of that's maybe of some use. I'm not sure. Any questions, comments, or thoughts about maybe your own possible projects in this general universe here? Yeah, we had one here. Yes, thank you.
Just wondering what you do. So you were talking about where things get reported in different ways.
Right.
What do you do in those situations if they're very different? So, for reference, I work on Cyprus, and the Turkish Cypriot and Greek Cypriot interpretations of the conflict are massively different. And I spent months trying to make a timeline of the conflict, but ended up kind of giving up and making two different timelines. Because for Turkish Cypriots it started in 1955, and for Greek Cypriots generally it started in 1974, and that's almost 20 years. So what do you do where they are just completely different?
So okay, there are lots of, that raises a lot of interesting issues. Okay, so now what I was describing here, was not, say, an overall interpretation of the trajectory the conflict. You know, it's on a level where, at least to a first approximation, you know, there would hopefully be less controversy in that you know, you're talking about, you know, for example, you know, there's a bombing, and what we want to know is, you know, what day did it happen on, where did it happen, you know, how many people were killed, how many people were injured, you know, like basic facts like that, you know, which is, you know, you would hope, you know, well, I think in reality, you know, it should be less controversial than like who started the conflict, you know, who's at fault, like what would be a good, you know, settlement to the conflict, you know, something like that. Now that said, you know, this kind of thing is hardly free of controversy, and certainly, like, if I add to my list a little bit, so very often you would want to know who is responsible for the event, you know, and so here, you know, you can get, you know, immediately debates about, you know, even what side was responsible. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the case that's just popping into my head now, but you know, there are, you know, thousands of cases. But the case that's popping in my head was the journalist who was. I don't know why I started talking about this because I don't have the details solid in my head. But the journalist who was killed in I think it was West Bank or Gaza, and then there was immediately you know, the Israelis put out a statement saying, you know, that she was probably killed by Palestinians, and you know, the Palestinians were saying the opposite, which I mean, at the moment the state of knowledge appears to be that she was killed by an Israeli soldier, but you know, there was a lot of controversy, you know, so people are arguing quite vehemently, like, who actually killed this person. And you know, if you're operating, like, that's one case that has been, it is getting examined under a microscope, and you know, we probably will have we may already have I think we already have a pretty convincing answer, you know, if not a 100% convincing answer on that one. You know, in a lot of conflicts, you know, things are happening at speed, and then, you know, accusations are flying back and forth. You know, there's a massacre committed, and each side is saying that the other side did it, and it. So what I think in cases like that, you know, if you're trying to create a database, you know, I think the only solution is to admit you don't know. You know, is to leave uncertainty here. So you know, in the ideal case, if you've got resources, a lot of this is done on a shoestring, you know, which is why, you know, the interest in, you know, well, can maybe computers help here, but you know, that you would archive stories with competing claims. You know, you could potentially, you know, even code a likely perpetrator, and even go a step further to, you know, have, like, you know, consensus view of the team, you know, even on a numerical scale, you know, like 0.8 probability that, you know, that this is the perpetrator, and, you know, here is the archive of stories if you want to delve more deeply into this case. Of course, I started out by describing a database on the Colombia conflict with more than 20,000 events. You know, you have to be realistic about, like, if someone is actually going to be working on this data, you know, they're not going to be delving into archives on, I mean, maybe in very particular important cases they might, but there's limits to the extent to which you can inspect event by event. By the way, very few projects that do this kind of conflict data, and I suspect in other areas, other projects, get into coding uncertainty. So usually they just make a judgment. They say, like, this is our best judgment, and then it's then embedded into the data as if, like, we know that this happened. And then you've got 20,000 events, maybe 3,000 of them you're not super sure, but that kind of gets, that uncertainty tends to get eliminated, just because it's hard to do all of that. That said, some of these databases, like, there's controversy over the number of people killed, and they'll have a range, like minimum to maximum, because they don't know. So that's one way in which uncertainty does come in.
Good, we got more questions. Yeah.
Could collecting and analysing the data in that way actually affect the quality of the data? Given that, the way search engines work, you immediately have people working out how to abuse them with, SEO strategies. I know there's, in countries, so Afghanistan, it's difficult to get reliable news, and the Taliban are pretty tech savvy. Would they immediately start putting pressure on whoever's doing the news reporting to start putting in data that otherwise would be sort of evanescent, because they know that it's going to be collated into something that then looks like a very sort of objective measure of the war?
Excellent question. Yeah. So and the problem is, I think, even deeper than your question suggests, because databases are increasingly trying to use social media. So you can just create. I mean, if your objective is to manipulate data that's being collected, you can just create, Facebook posts or Twitter posts, and then if you're sophisticated about it, you can even get them amplified, in ways that make it look like, there's confirmation out there. I mean, I know, I can't speak in great detail, but I know that, there are people working on, ways, to try to sift through reliable versus unreliable. I think the traditional media is perhaps not, I mean, at least, again, on these kinds of basic facts about events, maybe not so much subject to intimidation. The problem is more that the traditional media is not everywhere. That's why people are trying to use social media, to find more events that aren't making it into traditional media. But manipulation is for sure a big issue here. Was there a question right behind here? Yeah.
My question would probably stretch both of you. But with regards to the liberty with updating the rules behind the artificial or the computer program you're using. So, for example, in the case where you specifically set out some statements or words that you use to kind of give you the outcome or the output that you want, but how often can you update these things, or more like a simulation kind of thing that is able to update? Do you have to put the human part of it to impute into that, or you just let it go to the program and because it's been fed one thing, it sticks to that thing even though a lot of things have changed and just the system? Yeah.
Okay. That's a really great question. So I think one of the main advantages of getting the computer to do this is that you can change the rules, relatively easily. Now, I mean, like if, for example, some different kind of weapon, or some new kind of attack starts happening, and the system has not been, really set up to deal with that very well. You can go in and tweak it and get it to change. And the other thing that comes up, although all right, so stepping back a bit, so the project that I described in some detail here was really based on the idea of trying to get the computer to imitate what humans were doing, so if you decide later, like, well, we wish that we hadn't coded everything in that way, having done this now for a while, we realize that we made. I mean, actually, in the case of Iraq body count, there is one big thing where they would tell you, we wish we had done it differently, which is like they set out to record deaths of civilians, basically thinking, okay, civilian deaths they're getting short shrift, someone needs to take care of these. Military deaths are, being, handled much better, so, we're not needed so much for that. So we'll just focus on civilian deaths. But then what they found is that they spent inordinate amounts of time, they'd have a report about an event, and maybe 20 people are killed in this event. But then the question is, how many of them are civilians, and how were they combatants? Maybe all 20 were combatants, or maybe like some were civilians, some were combatants. And since they set out this methodology that they're only recording civilians, they would have to make a call on all of those, and that it would have been easier. They just said, we'll just do combatants too, and then maybe just have some uncertainty about, how many of these are civilians. But anyway, the problem I'm suggesting here is, they can't go back easily. Like in principle, they've got the whole archive there. They could just go back and just go through the whole thing again, and say, okay, we're changing our rules now. We'll just reevaluate, but that is just phenomenally costly. Like, there's no way that's going to happen. Okay, but if you've got a computer that is operating according to some rules, and maybe it makes more mistakes than the humans. Although that's so. I think Iraq body count is extremely careful. So I think that they make very few mistakes, but a lot of human coding is probably worse than machine coding. So we shouldn't just assume that automatically the humans are better at this. But in any case, whether the machine is better or worse, you can change the rule on the machine pretty easily, and then it could be like whatever, a matter of minutes or hours, or like if it's really if it's bigger data, maybe it's a few days, but you've got like a fresh data set with new rules, which you could never do with the humans. So that's an advantage.
There's been such a stream of political commentary. Will this happen? Won't this happen? Will this happen? Won't this happen? It's just been dominating the TV, for example, these reporters. Could we save a lot of time by applying machine learning to this kind of problem based on previous resigning MPs and politicians, etc.?
Be nice, wouldn't it? I can see several problems, however. First of all, the data set is rather small. We haven't got that many prime ministers to base it on. Actually, I've read at least one article which is attempting to do that kind of analysis but not involving a computer, just by human looking at what happened before, actually that's probably perfectly satisfactory. Yeah. Sledgehammer to crack a nut if you're getting machine learning into it. And then final comment is that there's a kind of potential feedback effect here, isn't there? That if you do this well, then the Prime Minister might well read about it and adapt their behaviour accordingly, which would be quite intriguing.
I mean, I think this raises the question of, when is it appropriate to just use traditional statistics or even, historical analysis, and when might machine learning, actually be useful? And I hadn't thought about the question before, but I would think, I mean, following what you said, that you'd want fairly big, I mean, maybe not big data in the sense that, computer science, would call something, big data, which is like just enormous, but, that it would need to be something on a bigger scale, with a lot more, where you'd need a lot more crunching ability than, would be the case here. Of course, you could look internationally to try to see, what are circumstances in which prime ministers resign in parliamentary systems. Undoubtedly, surely there's political science research on this. I don't know, but yeah.
Just as a footnote, again, it's important not to be blinded by science on this.
Right.
That most machine learning algorithms are actually formally equivalent to statistical algorithms.
Right.
So they're not two utterly different things.
I mean, one thing, at least within economics, and I think probably this is true of some of the other social sciences, the statistical analysis, has tended to really emphasize the property of unbiasedness, unbiased estimators. Whereas in machine learning, like kind of the first, go-to thing, is a squared error type of thing. But basically that trades off bias against variance, and doesn't necessarily, insist monomaniacally on unbiasedness as I know econometricians have over the years. So I think that's something that I don't know if you'd say it's a fundamental difference, or it has to be a fundamental difference between traditional statistics and machine learning, but de facto it has been a big difference in the way those two fields have tended to approach things.
Just a quick follow-up on from that, actually, maybe one of the closer to home examples of some of this is learning analytics, and now the way that being a student, just the being of a student now generates so much data that the learning analytics now are correlating student behaviours with outcomes, so that you can take the pattern of behaviour of somebody in their first year as a student maybe and infer their final degree classification. And there's a whole world of ethics around what's cause and what's effect here, what we do with that information, whether we use that to intervene, whether we inform people of what their kind of, risk factors are, like, okay, term one, if we can say 2-2, coming, on this pattern, what do we do with that? So, whether we can change the behaviour of a Prime Minister, this one, I don't think so, but, what we should do with the behaviours that we can connect with possible outcomes.
Of course, we could just talk about the rather old sociological theories about labeling theory, which is was invented long before AI.
But interesting question.
But it's already happening to some extent with standardized testing in schools, isn't it?
Yeah.
And at European global level, PISA results, they create a whole performance around what should count as learning and how we should assess it, and they rank countries, education systems across the globe according to these kinds of results. Big data is a big thing. But I wanted to ask a question around biases, because you've mentioned it a few times, bias and bias, objectivity. What do you mean by this, and how can we help students understand bias and biased objectivity, perhaps?
Thank you for asking that question, because I realized that when I was describing the second project, it's actually called AI4, I omitted a crucial feature of the work that we're doing, which is that we are carrying out the kind of games that I was talking about, not just in one country, but in 11 different countries. And these are chosen, these countries, because we expect the culture, in quotes, of these different countries to yield different views about what bias and justice is in these algorithms. And indeed, that suspicion, that hypothesis is turning out to be true. That the way in which, let's say, the Spanish case study is defining or thinking about bias is very different from the one in China, as examples. So the answer to your question, sort of answer to your question, is that there is no, as it were, objective bias. It's culturally specific.
I mean,
but you use it in a methodological way to make a distinction between statistics and machine algorithms, statistical and machine algorithms. Yeah. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about this.
I mean, let me just try to be really brief. But so I think there have been probably two slightly different concepts of bias floating around today, but also, I mean, kind of in common parlance, but in statistics, it has like a technical meaning that doesn't necessarily correspond. So like bias in the sense of like when I'm hiring, do I give women a fair chance? Whereas I'm always just seem to be interested in hiring men, or my department's processes, does it always seem to turn out men? So that's one sense of bias, like fairness, and then and I think it's related to the statistical, but it would be like if I had a system for predicting the temperature tomorrow, and it seems to me that we keep on getting, in the last week, they kept on predicting the heat wave would arrive, and it hasn't quite, so that like at least over the last 4 or 5 days, the temperature predictions seem to have been systematically lower, but if you compare the prediction for the temperature tomorrow with the actual temperature, and then calculate the deviation. I mean, they can't get it perfect every day, but does that average out to zero? Do the over prediction balance out, the under predictions? That's bias in the statistical sense. And I just wanted to make one other, because just from the presentation of Professor Hines, earlier, that just thought that I had, which is that we shouldn't slip into the the habit of thinking that if some algorithm, some biased algorithm isn't used, and instead we turn it over to humans, then we'll get unbiased decisions. As it like that if the creature that Dr. Frankenstein creates, turns out to be violent, that'll be like a shock because humans are never violent. Violence never would have happened except for the Frankenstein monster. But all that said, absolutely we should be scrutinizing, these algorithms, but we shouldn't give humans a free pass and just imagine, that they're doing a great job, whenever they're called upon to do it.
Okay, I'm afraid it was fascinating, but we have to stop here because there's lunch. Thank you so much, and maybe during lunch you have more opportunities to ask questions. Thank you. Oh.